Welcome to our session, Inflation, Its Causes, and the Way Forward. I want to take us back to a little bit about what we heard yesterday from Nora Loreto. She gave us an economic history that we don't usually talk about in Canada, and that was about the rise of capitalism in the 20th century in Canada. We learned about how natural wealth and other forms of wealth were appropriated in the 30s in the effort to produce for war. That wealth was appropriated by the public sector, by the state. The state innovated. The state created new goods that would be manufactured in Canada. But what happened after the war effort? Rather than continuing that effort of public production, what occurred is that that wealth was sold to private interests. And those private interests would become some of the largest corporations still in existence in Canada today. Come the 1970s, those corporations needed markets in which to expand. And they generated the lobby for the free trade agreements, which is the era that we are still in. That is not unlike actually what happened in the early 20th century when Canadian bankers, which are some of the oldest and richest corporations in the country, needed new markets. At the time, Canada was still a dominion of England. And those bankers used connections and the informal empire of Britain in Latin America to get to those markets in particularly South America and expand. This morning, we're going to hear about where Canada's corporations are today, the nature of their power, the profitability trends, and the links to taxation and workers' wages. Yesterday morning, Debbie Owusu-Akia encouraged coalition building among the left to build across issues rather than single issues. And what I want to suggest to us today is that the issue of taxation may well be the vehicle through which we can build coalitions to arrive at solutions to many of the problems we've been discussing this weekend, from healthcare to houselessness, to the affordability crisis. So our speakers today are Gillian Petit, Senior Research Associate at the U of C, University of Calgary. She's got a doctorate from the University of Calgary and a Juris Doctor from Queen's University. Her research focus is tax policy, municipal policy, income trends, access to justice, and she's the co-author of A Basic Income Grant for Canada. Our second speaker is Silas Xuereb, Researcher and Policy Analyst with Canadians for Tax Fairness and a Fellow of the World Inequality Database. He's also pursuing a doctorate under a SSHRC Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has publications in both the academic world and the policy world. Let us start then with you, Silas.
So today I'll be talking about how corporate profiteering fueled the affordability crisis. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys are already well aware of this, but hopefully I can give you some evidence on this and some arguments to use to talk about these issues. Just to motivate this first, what has happened in the past few years since the pandemic, of course, is we saw a huge increase in inflation since 2020. The percentages on the right give the percent increase in the consumer price index for various prices. Overall, prices have gone up by about 15.7%, and for some categories, some essential categories like food and shelter, prices have increased even further by 22% for shelter. And these trends, these price increases have not been equally felt. So this figure is from a recent article from the Parliamentary Budget Office. The blue bars show the change in household disposable income since 2019, and the yellow bars show the increase in the price of a basket of goods for each income quintile. So we can see for the highest income earners, their disposable income since 2019 has increased far, far higher than the price of a basket of goods for that group. But for the lowest quintile and the second lowest quintile, the price of a basket of goods has increased faster than their disposable income. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the affordability crisis. It's prices increasing, but disproportionately for lower income households. So let's look at some explanations that have been given for the affordability crisis. This is from a Bank of Canada report, and they give a few reasons for inflation over the past few years: a spike in commodity prices, a surge in the global demand for goods, and impaired supply chains. And these have all played some role in inflation. I'm not going to argue that they played no role. But then we've also got, this is from Philip Cross from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, the growth of government is driving wage and price inflation. From the National Post, we have government choices as well for high food costs, not greedflation. City News says the carbon tax going up is the reason for the housing affordability crisis. And the Fraser Institute says the Bank of Canada fueled today's inflation, right? So these are the explanations that a lot of mainstream and right-wing outlets are giving us. And I'm going to argue that these are all missing one key element from all of these narratives, which is just very simply that corporations set the price of most of the products we buy, right? Food, rent, if you're renting from a corporation, furniture, your car, most of these things, you're purchasing them from corporations. Corporations are setting the price. They are deciding how much you have to pay to purchase that good, right? Pretty simple and straightforward. I'm going to take a brief detour before looking at the evidence into kind of some economic theory, which I think is useful for understanding why these ideas are so widespread these days. So economic theory developed this idea of perfect competition, which is this theoretical concept that the Corporate Finance Institute says means that in a market with perfect competition, both producers and consumers are price takers, right? So the producers, the corporations, are price takers. They have no power over the price. But this idea relies on several key assumptions, including that there are many buyers and sellers in the market, right? So there has to be a lot of different producers producing the same good. They also rely on the assumption that firms can freely enter and exit the market at any time, and that there are no increasing returns to scale. And all of these assumptions don't really hold true in practice. But despite its reliance on these unrealistic assumptions, this idea that firms are price takers and they have no control, they have no influence over inflation, has become basically common sense, and it's parroted in news outlets all the time. But obviously, we don't live in this perfectly competitive world. This is a theoretical idea that's become very powerful, but it does not reflect reality. Some markets may come closer to this than others, but nowhere does perfect competition exist, where firms have zero control whatsoever over price setting. All corporations have some degree of price setting power. And so there are alternative explanations of inflation. They're not mainstream in the economics discipline, but they are out there, and I think they provide a much better understanding of inflation. One professor said this year, it is argued that from a post-Keynesian perspective, inflation is always and everywhere a conflict phenomenon with different potential triggers. So what does this mean? Basically, in this understanding of inflation, it's a conflictual process, right, between workers and the owners, the capitalists, the producers, where each group is going to fight for a larger share of the economic pie. Now, inflation can be triggered by a wide range of different events, right, and some of them that the Bank of Canada talked about, right, did occur during the pandemic. Disruptions to supply chains, pandemics, wars, these things can trigger bouts of inflation. But then what you're always going to get after that is a contestation between different groups for who's going to get the income that is created by these higher prices, right? When the prices go up, who is receiving that extra portion of the price? At different points in time, depending on the power that corporations have and the power that workers have, the gains from inflation are going to be distributed differently. This is one way that we can understand how inflation has occurred since the onset of the pandemic in 2020. This kind of model is from some colleagues of mine, Isabella Weber and Evan Wasner, and they term this process sellers inflation. They argue that starting from a kind of point of relative stability in prices, right? And stability doesn't necessarily mean unchanging prices. It can mean inflation at roughly 2%, 1 to 3%, the Bank of Canada target, right? But prices rising relatively predictably and stably over time. And then we have an impulse, right? This trigger that's going to change kind of the norm that producers are operating under. And this happened with the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns, as well as in 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine also was a kind of impulse event. What this does is it causes prices to rise in some upstream sectors, and profits may rise in those sectors as well. But then what we saw is that inflation did not stop there. Then we have this propagation and amplification phase where firms later on in the supply chain are going to raise their prices as well to protect their profit margins, right? But then also what we saw is that a kind of coordinated fashion here where they didn't just protect their profit margins, but they actually amplified the price increases and increased their profit margins. And they were able to do this because consumers' expectations had changed. They were expecting a larger price increase than normal, so they can kind of just tack on an extra couple percent. And then we have the conflict phase. And so after, again, inflation is always going to be a conflictual process, right? And so labor and workers are going to try and fight. They're noticing their purchasing power is eroding, and they're going to try and fight to win some of that purchasing power back and increase their real wages. So with that kind of theoretical framework in mind, let's look at the data from the last couple of years in Canada and look at who benefited from the inflation that took place. This is a figure just simply of pre-tax corporate profits since 2010 in Canada. We can see, you know, in the 2010s, profits are rising over time, but in 2021, we have a massive, massive spike of over $200 billion in profits compared to their pre-pandemic levels. We can see, just at first glance, that corporations profited hugely, hugely from the pandemic, and this has continued in 2022 and 2023. It might have come down a little bit in 2024, but we don't have full data on that yet, of course. Some pundits have argued that this was just due to input prices increasing, right? They're just protecting their profit margins. This is because the price of everything went up, right? It's not anything that corporations are doing in particular. But we can look at profit margins, right? So this is defined as the proportion of revenue minus costs divided by revenue, the proportion of revenue that is profits. And we can see in the pre-pandemic decade, again, about 8% profit margin was the average for corporations in Canada, and this spiked to 12% in 2021 and 2022. So a 50% increase in their profit margins. And we saw this come down a little bit in 2023, but still profit margins are well above pre-pandemic levels. I'm going to show more evidence, but this right here shows that firms were not just protecting their profit margins, but actually tacked on some extra to the prices. So this is just one way of calculating would have been if profit margins had remained at their pre-pandemic levels. So these orange bars are still increasing during the pandemic just because the economy is growing, but the red are the windfall profits, basically that the profits that corporations collected by increasing their profit margins since 2020. So in total, from 2021 through 2023, about $460 billion were collected in profits. More were collected in profits than if profit margins had stayed at their pre-pandemic levels. So can we link these higher profits to inflation directly? I would argue that we can. This chart is going to use a different measure of inflation than the CPI just because it's easier to break down into profits and wages. It's called the business sector price deflator. It's not that important exactly what it means, but it's essentially just a measure of the price level as well. Similar to the CPI, but slightly different. And this is from David McDonald from the CCPA, this chart. He separated the price changes that we observed from 2019 to 2022 into portions attributable to profits, to wages, and to other costs. And we can see the pink bars representing profits in 2021, almost all of the inflationary pressure in 2021, coinciding with when inflation picked up, was all going to profits. Towards the end of 2022, we start seeing other costs and wages picking up a little bit. I tried to calculate what would inflation have been during the pandemic if profit margins had not changed. So this red line is the business sector price deflator, again, just another measure of inflation from 2019 to 2023 with indexed at 100 in 2019. According to this measure, prices in 2023 were about 20% higher than they were in 2019. I calculated that had profit margins stayed at their pre-pandemic levels, in 2021, prices had increased by about 10% at that point, And if profit margins had stayed at their pre-pandemic levels, it would have only been about 2.5% at that point. Now, some of this gap has been made up by 2023, thanks to some big gains made by labor in 2023. So by 2023, if profit margins had stayed at pre-pandemic levels, we would have seen a price increase of about 16%. So about 20% of the price increase can be attributed to the rise in profit margins. So again, we would have had inflation regardless of this corporate profiteering, but it was made worse by corporations raising their prices much higher than they had to. One criticism that's also sometimes made of this argument is that this was only really driven by oil prices, right? So in 2022, there was the shock to oil prices driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Oil and gas companies have profited more than anyone else really since the pandemic. Some argue that this is really only a phenomenon of the oil and gas sector. And this is a partial truth. Oil and gas does account for a large portion of the increase in profits since 2019. This chart here shows the profit margins of various industries before the pandemic and in 2022, and we can see the biggest increase definitely in oil and gas extraction. But the other thing I want to point out is that the red bar here, representing the profit margin in 2022, is higher than the orange bar, the pre-pandemic profit margin, in nearly every single sector of the economy. So this is not just about the oil and gas sector. This is something that took place across the board in the corporate sector in Canada and in many other countries, similar in the US, since the pandemic. Just a quick note then on how corporations use these extra profits. What are they doing with them? Sometimes the right wing will argue, corporate profits are good. We need them to be reinvested in the economy, to grow the economy, right? Well, here is a figure of corporate investment of non-financial companies, and we can see that the red line there since the pandemic before and after is basically flat. Investment has not been increasing. The significant increase in profit margins basically had no effect on increasing investment. Instead, what they have used these extra profits for is stock buybacks. There was over $300 billion spent on stock buybacks from 2021 to 2023, about 15% of total corporate profits. And corporations also increased dividends to record levels, reaching $214 billion in 2023, 40% higher than pre-pandemic. So these extra profits are really just going to increase the wealth of the shareholders of corporations. Before turning to what we can do about this, I'm just going to give a couple examples that I think are interesting of some particular companies in some important sectors, and we can actually look at what is happening at the corporation level rather than just in the aggregate level. In rental housing, of course, we have an ongoing rental affordability crisis in this country right now, and these are the rent increases that 7 of the largest real estate investment trusts have imposed on their residents in the past couple of years. Boardwalk, which I think has actually a lot of units, I think 12,000 units here in Edmonton, increased rents by 8.8% in 2023. They tell you this, right? Corporations know that they set prices, right? Despite what the business press may tell you, corporations are aware of this. And you can read this in their annual reports. They tell you how they choose how to set prices. So they said, we continue to self-moderate the pace of rental adjustments. Does this sound like a price-taking firm that's just receiving a price from the market? No, they're self-moderating their price increases, right? And how are they choosing how to do this? They're balancing residents' experience with their sustainable returns. Basically, it's how much can we raise prices without pissing off our residents so much, right? Another Centurion REIT, in their annual report, they brag. They say, they're a little bit more passive in their language, but they say the REIT has grown its market rents significantly faster than market averages and inflation benchmarks. They're aware of this. They're trying to do this. They want to raise prices more than inflation. We can also look at Loblaws. Loblaws, of course, very popular in the news in the last few years, and they were called to testify in front of Parliament, right? And they said, no, we didn't increase prices more than we had to. Well, in 2021, if you look at their annual reports, their revenue increased by $456 million. At the same time, the cost of the goods that they sold decreased by $335 million. I don't know how you can increase your revenue and lower your costs without raising prices. The cost that they paid for the goods they sold declined, but at the same time, they sold those goods for more money. We can also hear what themselves have to say about this. Their CFO in 2021 said, our internal measures of inflation are trending slightly higher than CPI. they are also aware of this, that they are raising their prices higher than the overall consumer price index. They even explain why. We're getting better at using data. It's starting to make a difference. It's translating into more effective promotional strategies that are driving sales and margin. Margin meaning profit margin. So they are figuring out how to optimize their data to set prices higher, basically, and earn higher profits. If we look at their profit margins by year, in the pre-pandemic period, it averaged about 2.8%, around 3% in most years. And 2021 through 2023, their margins were over 4.5%. One last quote from Galen Weston. He says, "We are watching our price position very, very carefully. We do it every week. The merchandising teams are seeing more opportunities to get more sales for less price reductions than we were seeing last year. That's what we're trying to optimize for right now. That's what you've seen the teams do over the last 9 months. That's driven a big part of the margin expansion." The corporations tell you, we are setting prices and we are increasing our margins. It's not that complicated. To sum up, corporations set prices for most products, right? It is their decisions to increase prices that have contributed to inflation over the past several years. As the Loblaws example, I think, is especially informative, big corporations have access to so much data now, so much data to calculate exactly how many people are going to buy their product when they set their price at particular levels. And they're going to continue using this more and more to optimize their prices and increase their margins as much as they can. This is especially concerning. I picked Loblaws and the rental market in particular because these are essential goods, right? Food and housing. People can't choose not to buy them if they can't afford them one month. So allowing corporations to have the power to increase these prices at any time is especially concerning. So if we don't do anything about this, right, corporations are going to continue to be able to do this in the future. So what can we do? Tax reform is one thing. I work with Canadians for Tax Fairness. I'm going to talk about taxes. I'll also talk about some other things, though. Yeah, we should design our tax system and our economy more generally so that price gouging is not profitable. We can do this. In one case, we can impose a windfall profits tax. We already did this to some extent with the banking sector, with the Canada Recovery Dividend, but this could be extended across the economy. The Liberal government considered a windfall profits tax on the oil and gas sector last year. They bailed on it at the last minute under a lot of pressure. And basically what this means, to be more precise, is taxing a portion of those $460 billion that they earned in excess of a normal profit over the past few years. We can just take that away. It's been done. We did it in World War I and World War II. A lot of European countries have done it in the past couple of years, and we could do that as well. And we could use this revenue to build non-market housing, to build essential goods that are where the price is not controlled by corporations. And the other thing this would do is tell corporations that there's the political will here to do this again. If they're going to price gouge in future crises, we'll take the profits away again then too. The other thing is reforming the income tax system. This is both on the personal and corporate side. This is the top marginal tax rate in Ontario from the 1950s to 2000, a steep decline. In the mid-20th century, we had much higher top marginal tax rates, and there's no reason that we can't return to 70, 80% top marginal tax rates. Again, this is not to impact most people, but just millionaires and billionaires. And we also know that top incomes really exploded when these top marginal tax rates fell, right? The more money you allow wealthy individuals to keep, the more incentive they have to do this price gouging and profiteering, right? We can take away that incentive. But tax reform is not the only thing that we can do here. One thing is strengthening competition rules. This has already been done. The Competition Act was strengthened last year, but we need to enforce them rigorously. We need to block mergers, block the HSBC-RBC merger, these Rogers-Shaw mergers, right? They're going to continue happening, and that is going to increase corporations' price-setting power more and more every time that happens. The other thing is we can politicize prices and profits, right? I think that part of the reason this idea of perfect competition, that corporations have no control over prices, it became so popular, was purposely to depoliticize the economy, right? To tell us that we have no control over the prices of the things that we buy. We saw this with the Loblaws boycott, right? That we can tell corporations, hey, no, if you're going to increase prices like this, we're going to stop buying from you, right? It wasn't a huge impact, but it did have an impact. And we can also, of course, unions. Again, I'll repeat, unions made huge gains through striking in 2023, right? The reason that real wages recovered so much in 2023 was because unions and labor fought for it, right? So if every inflationary process is a conflictual process, and labor needs to be there to push for larger gains each time that's happening. Finally, as I was talking about with housing, increase public and cooperative ownership, right? Just take the production of essential goods out of corporations' hands, especially for housing, and hey, why not food as well? And as Nora was talking about yesterday, we used to have grand corporations for everything, right? We could do that again. So thank you.
So Silas talked a little bit about the affordability crisis and corporations, and I'm going to talk a bit about how it's impacted people. In October of this year, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson won the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on inclusive economies, inclusive institutions, so I thought I'd take a page out of their book and frame my talk today in inclusive economies. So an inclusive economy is one where resources needed to be economically active or equitably distributed across the population. Inclusive economies have inclusive economic institutions that incentivize workers to increase their labor productivity, and they create sustained economic growth. Now, Acemoglu and Robinson, in their book, Here Why Nations Failed, as an institution, they focus on property rights. So they argue that property rights need to be equitably distributed to incentivize workers to work, because that's the only way they'll keep their gains from whatever they create. So I want to take this one step forward and say, today in Canada, property rights are great, but something that we also need to focus on is income and basic resources. So in order to create sustained economic growth, we need to have equitable distribution of basic resources to incentivize people to productively engage in the economy. If you can't put food on your table and you can't put a roof over your head, you're not going to go out there and want to, innovate for your employer. That seems like a stretch. So economies that have policies that result in increasing income inequality or that result in increasing populations that just don't have basic resources will fail to increase their labor productivity or sustain their labor productivity, and will fail, therefore, to sustain economic growth. So in today's talk, I wanted to kind of look at three questions. I'm going to focus on Alberta. I'm going to ask, is Alberta becoming more or less inclusive? And I'm going to focus on particularly Albertans with lower income. What institutions and policies are making Alberta less inclusive? What can we do to make Alberta more inclusive? So first question then, is Alberta becoming more or less inclusive? So spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that Alberta is becoming less inclusive. And I'm going to show you why I think this. Income inequality in Alberta has increased recently. So in this graph, what I'm showing you is something called the Gini coefficient. So if we have a Gini coefficient of 0, that means we have perfect income inequality. It means everyone in our economy has exactly the same amount of income. And a Gini coefficient of 1 means that we have perfect income inequality. One person gets all the income and everybody else gets no income. In reality, most jurisdictions are somewhere between 0 and 1. No one's 0 and no one's 1. So what I'm showing you in this graph then is the Gini index for both Alberta and for Canada in 2019, so pre-pandemic, and then in 2022, which is the most recent year for which we have data. I'm showing you our Gini index for market income, so that's like your employment income, and then after-tax income, so that's after redistribution. So between 2019 and 2022, income inequality in Canada increased. It increased by 2.6%. In Alberta, income inequality also increased, and it increased faster than in the rest of Canada. In Alberta, income inequality increased by 4.6%, so almost double of that in Canada. So we have faster growing income inequality in Alberta than in Canada. So what has this meant for people with low income? We have also seen at the same time as increasing income inequality, an increase in the low income rating in Alberta. So what I'm showing you in this slide is our low income rate. In Canada, there's 3 measures of low income, so I'm showing you all of them to be fair. In the top left-hand corner, I'm showing you the market basket measure of low income. So the market basket measure is Canada's official poverty line. What we do is we take a basket of goods and services that we think are necessary to have a basic quality of life, and we compare a family's income to the cost of that basket of goods and services in the geographical region in which a person is living. So between 2019 and 2022, in Canada, the low income rate decreased by 4%. This is not what happened in Alberta. In Alberta, over that same time period, our low income rate increased by 26%. In Calgary, it was more pronounced. Our low income rate in Calgary, I'm from Calgary, increased by 96%. All right, that's huge. There's a recent paper out from Statistics Canada that's expecting another increase in the low income rate for Alberta again for when the 2023 data comes out. What this graph is showing you now, it's not just about income. Along with increasing low income rate, our food insecurity rate in Alberta is increasing. In Alberta, just note we have one of the highest levels of food insecurity across all the provinces. So for being a high income province, we have a problem with food insecurity here. But between 2019 and 2022, the food insecurity rate in Canada grew by 9.5%. In Alberta, it grew faster. It grew by 13.5%. Again, that's huge. These are people who are not having enough food on their table for either themselves or their children. In this graph, what I'm showing you now is the core housing need. This is the percent of people in the population who either have unaffordable, unsuitable, or overcrowded housing. Again, in Canada, we saw between 2019 and 2022 an increase in core housing need. It increased by 1.5%. Note that Canada, that includes Toronto and Vancouver in there. In Alberta, our core housing need rose by 10.8%, way higher, way faster than the increase in core housing need in the rest of Canada. A lot of this core housing need was actually not in Calgary and Edmonton, but it was actually in smaller municipalities and in rural regions. So I'm going to argue then, based on these statistics, that Alberta is becoming less inclusive. Our income inequality is growing at a faster rate than in the rest of Canada, and more persons in Alberta are experiencing poverty compared to pre-pandemic. And the rate of persons experiencing poverty, whether it be food insecurity or core housing, is increasing faster than in the rest of Canada. So more persons are short on the basic resources they need to survive, to put food on their table and a roof over their head. These are not people who are going to be interested necessarily in productively engaging in the economy. They're struggling to make ends meet. They're not out there innovating for their employer. The next question I want to look at is what institutions and policies are contributing to this reduction in inclusion. So I'm going to look at 3. There might be more, but I'm going to focus on 3 today. So the first one I want to think about is wages. So wage growth in Alberta has slowed compared to the rest of Canada. Part of the Alberta advantage we often hear is how high our incomes are and how fast our wages are growing. This trend has reversed in recent years. So between 2019 and 2022, the average hourly wage rate in Canada increased by 13.1%. So note that between this time period, that's about the rate of inflation. But look at Alberta. Between 2019 and 2022, our average hourly wage only grew by 5.2%. That's much lower than the rate of inflation. Some policies that I think, so this is going to be my opinion, are contributing to this reduction in wage growth are wage suppression policies that are being pursued by the government. So one of them, I'm showing you one of them here, is Alberta is tied for last place for the lowest minimum wage. Our minimum wage is $15 an hour. We're tied with Saskatchewan for $15 an hour. If you're under 18, your minimum wage is $13 an hour. And Alberta's minimum wage hasn't changed since 2018. So because it hasn't changed since 2018, it definitely hasn't kept up with inflation. So the real value, the amount of goods and services you can buy for minimum wage has declined. Other wage suppression policies, I won't dwell on this one too much because I think there's other talks on it here, but Alberta has some anti-union policies, right? Bill 32 is associated with a decrease in unionization rate in Alberta. So in this chart, what I'm showing you is the union coverage rate. So this is the percent of employees covered by a collective bargaining agreement or who pay union dues. In Canada, between 2019 and 2022, unionization rate grew by 1.7%. In Alberta, it declined by 1.6%. Possibly related to Bill 32, I would think. That's my wage suppression policies. The next policies that I want to look at are welfare policies in this province. Welfare income is the income that people who have no other income sources receive. So this includes largely provincial social assistance and then some federal programs, so like the Canada Child Benefit and the GST HST credit. What I'm showing you in this graph is welfare income as a percent of the market basket measure. So this means I'm taking that basket of goods and services that's costed out for different geographical regions, that basket of goods and services that we think you need to minimally have to have a basic standard of living, If you're a single adult who's considered employable in Alberta, you can only afford, as of 2022, 0.35% of that basket of goods and services. How much you can afford decreased between 2019 and 2022. So Alberta's in the green box there. So in 2019, you could afford 0.38% of that basket. In 2022, that declined to 0.35%. Alberta has one of the lowest social assistance benefits amounts of all the provinces. So we're tied with Ontario and New Brunswick. So this is the same graph I'm showing you again. This is for a single adult with disability. So in Alberta, we like to hear about, or the politicians like to tell you about how AISH is so much better than what all the other provinces are doing, and it is, right? If you're on AISH, in 2019, you could afford 84% of that MBM basket of goods and services. This decreased to 0.76% of that MBM basket of goods and services in 2022, so the real value of AISH went down between 2019 and 2022. And notice you still don't get 100% of that MBM basket of goods and services if you're on AISH. If you are a single adult with disabilities, and they're either not permanent disabilities, so you can't get on AISH, or for whatever reason you can't prove that you have a permanent disability, the forms are very complicated. You instead go on this other program called Barriers to Full Employment. And if you're on that program, you can only get 0.4% of that market basket as of 2022. So we have very low welfare income in Alberta. And kind of the last policy here that I want to look at are our tax rates, because, the Alberta advantage, we've got low taxes, right? That's true. We have low taxes. So what I'm showing you on this slide is the average provincial personal income tax that's payable depending on what your income is. So Alberta is the yellow line. I've got Quebec in the black line because Quebec's got very high personal income taxes. What we see here is that almost at every level of income, we've got fairly low personal income taxes. So for example, if you're making about 140 to 150K, you're paying about $10,000 of provincial income taxes. One of the economic reasons we might want to keep provincial income taxes low is because it's supposedly going to incentivize you to work harder. You work harder, we're going to keep your taxes low, so keep working harder. We're not going to tax you so much. The other thing I want to note here before I go to my next slide is that personal income taxes are low for high-income earners, okay? I only extended this out to 300K, but it keeps going. In Alberta, if you're, making 300K, you're paying way less taxes than anyone else in any other province here. No surprise, right? We're pretty far below. Now, the problem with not just low taxes, but the way that our tax schedule works is that in Alberta, if you're between, say, that 20K to about 100,000, your taxes are progressive, meaning if you earn more, you pay more in taxes as a percent of your income. So what I'm showing you in this slide is your taxes as a percentage of your income. So if you're making here 100K, you're paying about 6% of your income in taxes, okay? So it's very steep in the lower income ranges. But as we move into the upper income ranges, that curve flattens out. It means that higher income earners are not paying more taxes as they earn more money. In Alberta, once you hit about 140K, you're paying about 8% in provincial taxes, and that's it. When we think about the tax system, one of the tenets of the tax system that economists tend to believe is that the tax system should be fair, meaning if you earn more, you should pay more. We should see that slope continuing to increase because that would be a fair tax system. The flatter your slope gets, the less fair your tax system is. And Mark Lee from CCPA out in BC has a great paper that if you take this, so this is just personal income taxes, and you add in corporate income taxes and your GST, HST, at those top income levels, provincial taxes are very, very regressive. So why do we do this? If you have low taxes, and you have less progressive taxes at the top, that's supposed to create an incentive to work harder and earn more money. Is it working, though? Alberta has pursued policies that put downward pressure on wages, so wage suppression policies, and that are intended to incentivize individuals to earn more money, right? Low taxes and less progressive taxes at higher income levels. Alberta has also pursued what I would call these stick policies. So if you're working a minimum wage job, or maybe not working at all because you're on social assistance, they're going to make life hard for you. Because if we make life harder for you, you're going to want to work harder and earn more money. So we're not going to give you too much money, so that way you're going to work harder. But as I showed you in the previous section, these policies aren't working. This policy mix is not incentivizing people to work harder. What it's doing, it's ensuring that people who are in low income stay in low income. If you can't put food on your table and a roof over your head, why would you go out there and try to earn more income? I mean, think about it this way. If you don't have enough money to put your child in childcare so that you can go to work, right? Are you going to work? So Alberta institutions for low-income persons are becoming less inclusive. They're not providing the necessary resources that are needed to actively participate in the economy. Can Alberta change its institutions and policies to reverse directions and make the economy more inclusive? So these are just some policy recommendations now. The first thing I think Alberta needs to do, I think both like we as people and the government, is that we need to change how we think. I'm starting with this one because I think it's really important. So we can't incentivize people to be productive workers by making social assistance and low-skilled jobs unattractive. What we need to do is we need to provide people with a minimum level of resources so that if they choose to be, they can be actively engaged in the labor market. People need a minimum level of resources and dignity to productively participate in the economy. So we need to change our thinking from, how do we make welfare and these low-wage jobs unattractive and like beat people to make them move up the income scale. Like that's a lot of the way these welfare minimum wage policies are set, to how do we make sure that people have an adequate level of resources so that they can productively engage in the economy if they are able to. And if they're not able to engage in the economy, how can we make sure that they have a basic, dignified quality of life? Second, increase and index the minimum wage. Like I said, we have one of the lowest minimum wages in Canada. We need to increase that. One idea definitely that I like is this idea that we look at what the living wage is needed. What type of living wage is needed? So the living wage is the hourly wage a worker needs to cover their basic expenses and have a modest standard of living after taxes and transfers. So in Calgary, the Living Wage Network estimates this as about $23.70, Edmonton $22.25. Economic evidence suggests that an increase in minimum wage has a limited direct effect on employment. So if you increase your minimum wage, you're not going to get all these people moving into unemployment all of a sudden. That's a myth that's largely been discredited by the economic empirical revolutions. If you increase the minimum wage, it can actually reduce wage inequality in the bottom half of the wage distribution. The evidence on whether the minimum wage can reduce poverty is mixed because it depends what the government decides to do with their transfers after minimum wage changes. Second, reduce barriers to unionization and stop wage suppression policies, right? Stop policies so Albertans who want to unionize can, and then I'm in the public sector, so I think the government should negotiate honestly and publicly with the public sector. Fourth, increase income assistance benefits and wraparound supports. In 2023, the Alberta government did increase our income supports by 6% and indexed them to inflation. Now, I made these slides a couple weeks ago, so since then, the Alberta government has rolled back that indexation to inflation and decided not to fully index income assistance benefits anymore. But anyway, we do need to increase income assistance benefits so that people can have a minimum standard of living. And literature shows that increasing income assistance benefits is associated with reduced food insecurity. I think we also need to improve access to programs that are often overlooked, access to in-kind support. So when you go to apply for income assistance, you have to have a form of ID and a SIM card and a bank account and a mailbox and all of these things. And a lot of people applying for income assistance don't have this. If you've fled violence, because you have violence in your home, so you fled violence, or you're living, you're experiencing homelessness, you might not know where your ID and SIM card is. It is an administrative nightmare to apply for ID when you have no ID. So these in-kind supports need to be strengthened. And in this way, we want to make sure that people who are on income assistance can actively participate in the economy if they're able to. I should also mention another important wraparound support. Access to professional clothing so people can go to interviews, and access to tools. If you need, because some professions you'll need your own tools. Fifth, and lastly, increase taxes and tax progressivity specifically for high income earners. So this can be done by implementing a new top marginal rate or higher marginal rates for those with high incomes. While this would increase taxes on high income earners, it would also make the tax system fairer, We would also see an increase in government revenue, and they could then spend it, say, on income assistance benefits. As well, economic evidence shows that tax cuts for the rich lead to higher income inequality and do not increase economic growth. So if we increase taxes to high-income earners, this is not necessarily going to reduce economic growth, which is what I think a lot of mainstream media has somewhat written about and wants you to believe. Tax cuts don't trickle down. Let's take it from them, right? In conclusion, to create an inclusive economy and sustained economic growth, people need access to resources to pursue economic activities. A recent history of suppressed wage growth and policies that disincentivize being poor have reduced access to resources for those with the lowest income. And this has increased the number and rate of Albertans who are struggling to survive. So even if they wanted to, they're not going to be actively participating in the economy. To improve inclusion, we need to address these policies and particularly address kind of their underlying rationales and how we think. All right, so that is it. Thank you.
I know a couple of years ago, or maybe less, I don't know, I saw in the news that European countries did try to curb margin for profits for corporations, especially for essential products. And I believe France was the first one, and I know UK were considering doing it. It's not that well covered here, so I'm not sure if I came across how effective those legislation measures were. The second part of my question is there any appetite, or could there be any appetite here in Canada from governments to do the same to affordability? I would suggest if they are able to do something like this, well, to increase affordability, they'll win the next election. So I'm just curious why they wouldn't do it if there isn't any appetite. Thanks.
On the European question, there definitely were implemented forms of excess profits taxes in the past couple of years in a lot of European countries and in the UK. Most of them, as far as there might be others, but the ones I'm aware of were focused on the oil and gas sector especially and on electricity producers. As far as I can tell, they've been pretty successful in raising revenue. They definitely raise revenue that can be used to give to people to increase their purchasing power. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily effective at reducing actual prices. I think if you actually want to bring prices down, you would need price controls, which I'm not necessarily aware that any European countries have done. But as far as I can tell, the excess profits taxes that were implemented on these sectors have been quite successful in Europe. Some of them are starting to be repealed or expiring at this point now, but in 2022 and 2023, I think they raised quite a bit of revenue there.
How do you feel about guaranteed basic income?
I believe that people need enough income to live with dignity. The problems with some of the basic income proposals is that what they tend to do is they want to see the government give everyone a basic income and then get out of other support. So for example, when I'm thinking about women fleeing domestic violence, they're like, okay, well, we'll just give them an income, but we won't necessarily have women's shelters now because we don't have enough money because we gave it all out in a basic income, so you guys should just take it and be happy. And that's the problem with the basic income, is that it's very expensive, and income does help a lot of these issues like food insecurity and core housing, but it doesn't address the heterogeneity of needs that we see in these populations. So we still need all of these wraparound supports and specialized supports for peoples with different needs. Make sure that we got this kind of basic level of income while addressing wraparound supports. And so it's not exactly what basic income proponents would think of as a basic income, because what I'm talking about now is a system of supports instead of having just a basic income.
I was raised in the Keynesian economics. One of the principles was if you flood the market with too much money, the government spending, you've got an inflationary effect because you've got too much dollars out there chasing too few goods. Excess government spending is a factor there. How does this apply to military spending when it is going very, very high? The proposals to spend 2% on NATO into the future. This has got to have some inflationary effect, but I never hear this addressed.
On the overall point, I mean, I think that massive increases in demand from anyone, whether it's government or from huge investors, can lead to inflationary pressure, but it's definitely not the whole story or the only part of the story. When it comes to military spending in particular, it's not something that I've thought a ton about, but I do think that, putting aside the question of whether we should actually try to reach the NATO target, which I don't think I would say that we need to, but the potential for inflation there is probably relatively limited, assuming that government raises taxes or uses some other forms to fund a lot of that spending, that they're not just massively deficit spending. I don't see why it would have a particularly massive inflationary effect. I assume that that target, if we were trying to reach that, would be reached gradually over time. It's not going to be just like all at once. So I wouldn't be too concerned about a big inflationary pressure there.
So I just have a quick comment and then a question for you. You know, with the rise in right-wing governments, I see all of these tactics as a way to ensure their continued success in elections, right? So if you have people who can't afford basic needs during the hierarchy of, looking at the hierarchy of needs, we are less likely to be engaged in politics, right? And the decisions that affect us. And so it behooves them to make us be struggling for basic dignity, because then we can't get involved in those higher conversations. Part of the affordability crisis, I think, is really important to invest in public services. When we don't pay for things out of pocket, but in fact from our tax base, that makes life more affordable when you don't have to take your check out or your credit card out to pay for those things. In Alberta, people are reluctant to talk about tax reform here because for so long we've been fed this belief that if we have low taxes, we'll garner more investment and then we'll have more jobs and people will be more successful. And so when we talk about tax reform, the middle class freaks out and thinks that we're talking about them. Most of us aren't in the $300,000 tax bracket. That's who we're talking about. It's this unequal distribution of wealth. And of course, the lowest wage workers are affected the most severely. Even when the increases come, I mean, if they get the same increase as somebody who makes $120,000 a year, that's not the same kind of increase. And a comment about unionization. We have many unionized workers who are living just above the poverty line. So that isn't a guarantee. I want to say it's not a guarantee, but it does help raise basic income for everybody. My question is about the ability to have price controls and less of a monopoly. Like, we know that there's I don't know what the number is, but let's just say 20 companies that manufacture almost all the goods and services that we use. So there's this monopoly, even though they have a different name. We're looking at legislation for grocery stores. They came close, right? They said, we're going to put in a code of ethics for grocery stores. And then they backed right down because the grocery store said, no, we'll do it on our own. We'll be on our best behavior. Do you see that there is a possibility that legislation would be effective to actually bring prices in line? Because with the bread price fixing, we saw that companies were willing to give people $25 a piece if you bought bread. So they obviously could afford those penalties. It's like a risk and reward benefit for them. Like, how much money are they willing to give away in order to continue a monopoly on our services?
Just to comment on your first one about the Conservatives are actually more in favor of a basic income than the Liberals or the NDPs because they can get out of so many others, providing so many other supports. It actually reduces the size of the government. I'll talk about the food industry first. I'm probably going to be a little bit different than what we've kind of heard from other places in the panel, but I don't think food prices or food controls are the answer, food price controls. And this is because it distorts the market. But I do believe that using the tax system to collect taxes on windfall profits is more of the right answer. It's less distortionary than fixing prices.
A couple of comments on the issue of taxes and the link to public services. I think it's very important whenever we talk about tax reform to be connecting it to what are we going to fund with this. I think that's to be clear that this is how you are going to get more public services, better quality public services, non-market housing, right? These are the things that we want to provide. That is a way that we need to talk about it to get broader public support for tax reform. And we need to be better at messaging that, when we're talking about this tax reform, it's tax increases on the wealthiest 1%, not middle class tax increases. So yeah, I mean, that's just, a messaging problem that we need to figure out how to message that better. On the food price issue, there can be room for price controls sometimes. They have to be done carefully, but I think they have been done before and we could do them again. But yeah, there is very, very little political support for that. A windfall profits tax could discourage them from doing this in the future, would be another option. I think, seriously, crown corporations, we used to create these. we can do that again. We can create public companies to compete with these private companies, right? In the food sector and in other sectors. There's a lot of tools available to us, and increasing competition in these markets is another way to do it. And the Competition Bureau is taking a more activist role now, which is great to see. That'll take a long time before we can really see the fruits of that.
Gillian, towards the end of your presentation, you had proposed that higher income earners should be paying more in taxes, like a higher percentage of taxes. And I was wondering if you could provide the rationale for that position.
So right now, as a percentage in Alberta, higher income earners pay absolutely the lowest taxes as a percent of their income. One of the economic rationales for this is to incentivize people to continue to earn more money, and then maybe this will trickle down to the rest of us, and we'll all be better off because we'll see increasing investment or whatever. But I think it's clear that that's not working. That these higher income earners, they're making more money and they're keeping it, right? It's not trickling down, or if it is, we've got a cheesecloth in the way, right? We've got like a drop or two coming out, but that's about it, right? We've got a lot of room to move in Alberta on this, right? Because we sit so far below the other provinces. Like, I'm not saying we need to, jack prices up to Quebec or higher, to the Quebec level or higher, but we've definitely got room to grow and put it up to the same level as other provinces. And we often hear this rhetoric again that, it'll decrease our competitiveness. We won't be able to attract skilled labor into the province. But when we're sitting so low, and when we're not seeing those benefits trickle down or investment increase, it's not working. So it's time to get in there and do something else.
Two questions to Silas. One is recently McKay of the Royal Bank talked about oligopolistic competition and how fierce it was in the banking system. Your reaction to that? Second question is, in your studies on real estate companies or food companies, have you looked at the share prices before and after?
On the banking competition, there was a report recently by a research group. I think they're called I'm going to script their name, North something Economics, Northeast, Northview, something like that. They compared the Canadian banking sector to the UK banking sector. And they basically found that when you compare the proportion of fees that Canadians pay for their banking services to the proportion paid in the UK, in Canada we're paying far, far, far higher fees than they do in the UK for the same services, basically. Yeah, I would find that hard to believe that what the RBC person is saying is true. Obviously, he has a concerted motivation to make the banking sector look a certain way. I think that's probably a self-serving argument there. On your second question, I haven't looked too much in particular at the share prices, to be honest. We have of particular companies, but I mean, we have seen huge stock market expansion in the past few years. So yeah, we can see that ability to charge higher prices is translating into higher valuations for companies as well.
My question is primarily addressed to Silas. I'm going to speak from personal history. In the early 1970s, I worked building houses just as a carpenter. I remember back then houses, this is the Vancouver area, were selling like $25,000, $30,000. And a few years later, I talked with Jack, who I was working for. And I said, well, gee, the houses are now $50,000. And I said to him, at this rate, it won't be long till there'll be $1 million. And of course, I didn't believe that was possible at that time. And here we are that these properties are multiple millions of dollars. I was visiting my great niece who lives in Surrey, BC. I said, well, what's this property worth? Well, she said, according to the tax assessment or the assessment, it's about $1 million. But the actual house itself is only valued at $330,000. Well, where's the rest of the money? Actually, it's just the land. Why don't we go and attempt at the replacement cost of a house? If you burn the house down, what's the replacement cost? That should be a determining factor in the price of real estate. But somehow this has now gone into speculation. The dot-com bubble, a lot of these big corporations went into real estate because it was a more sure thing. And I think that's part of the problem.
Thank you for your presentations, and I fully agree with the concepts you presented. I just got a couple of questions about your graphs and information. Gillian, when you're talking about average income in Alberta, both Calgary and Edmonton and Alberta in general have had a large influx of immigration and population increase. And is that included in your analysis, in your charts there? Because of that population increase probably lowers it, and do we have effective policies to handle the assimilation of the population coming in? The second question I had, Silas, was during COVID, Canada, US, and European countries took on trillions of dollars of debt. And I think our corporate sponsored governments taking on and putting all that debt contributed hugely to inflation. Do you want to comment on that?
On the land prices point, I think that's, speculation on land is a huge role in the housing affordability crisis. That's definitely something that we need to address. Then on the debt, on inflation part, again, I think that it probably played some small role in the inflation. Again, inflation can be triggered by a whole bunch of different things. A massive increase in government spending can play some role in that. But to me, again, the key question with inflation always is who ends up getting the benefits from that, right? These extra prices are going somewhere, and in the first couple of years of the pandemic, those extra prices went to the corporations.
So I do know that the populations in Calgary and in Edmonton have increased, but honestly, the Alberta government was out there, what were those ads a couple of years ago under Kenny's, like, come to Alberta? If we were going to pitch those ads, why wouldn't we have been able to handle the influx? It was poor policy planning, and we should have been ready, and now that we're not, we need to face reality. We need to face that we have increasing people with low income, and now we need to do something about it. I just want to go back to the housing comment. In a separate strand of research, I actually work on the financialization of the housing market and property taxes. And it's actually, again, it's a policy issue. We have governments that are pursuing policies that turn houses from a living space to an investment tool. And we're making policy choices, and then we stand around and we're like, why is this happening? Well, we made that choice. So we've got to deal with it. We've got to face those.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, Silas.